Welcome to Pondering AI. I'm your host, Kimberly Nevelo. I'm so pleased you're joining us as we continue to ponder the realities of AI for better and for worse. Today, we are joined by the inimitable Marianna Ganapini. Marianna is a professor of philosophy at Union College, the co-founder and CEO of Logica Now, a consultancy that seeks to educate and engage organizations in ethical inquiry. She's a faculty director and instructional designer at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, and is also a fellow and associate researcher and collaborator at a number of other public and academic institutions. Marianna joins us today to discuss how organizations and individuals developing or using AI can engage in practical ethical inquiry. So thank you for joining us, Marianna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is great.
Now, your research and work cover quite a lot of ground, but I suspect they have some common underpinnings. Mm-hmm. What was it that drew you to the study of the philosophy of mind, and how did that then lead to your current work in applied AI ethics?
Sure. I started really kind of loving philosophy, to be honest. The whole thing. I love history of philosophy. I love the ethics. I love the philosophy of mind. Like the whole spectrum really interested me. And so when I came to the US and I was able to start a PhD program at Johns Hopkins, as I was sort of progressing in the program, I figured that the part that I really loved was the intersection between philosophy and psychology, philosophy and cognitive science, and really sort of figuring out how we think, why we think so weirdly sometimes, and all these kind of big questions that I thought were like very, very exciting. And this is how you have to do it for your PhD, dissertation, you have to narrow it down. So I did so. And so that got me really thinking about AI, which is linked to philosophy of mind because it's a reflection of what does it mean to think, and what does it mean to have consciousness? What does it mean to have understanding? All these questions are just now the questions that we ask about AI. Does AI think? Does AI understand? Does AI have consciousness? And so on and so forth. So this is sort of kind of how I got from philosophy broadly to this more sort of specialized topic.
Well, we'll try not to turn this into a counseling session for all of us in AI today. Or maybe we will. I don't know. We'll see. Now, one aspect of your work looks at how AI-driven systems influence human perceptions and our decision-making. It's a topic that's increasingly imperative, particularly as language becomes a primary interface mechanism. And this has obviously been driven by the huge influx and release of commonly available LLM systems. Now, certainly behavioral design is not new. It predates the digital revolution, although analytics has certainly allowed us to up the ante in that regard. But in some of your work, and such as the paper on the audit framework for nudging in children, you argue that AI systems are unique. So what is it about AI-driven nudging that requires increased scrutiny or attention?
Right. So as you said, nudging behavioral techniques been there for a while. Behavioral economics talks about it. As they have been implemented in various fields. They're based on the idea that you can somehow influence people's behavior by exploiting some of the biases that we all have. Okay, so we're dual thinkers in a sense. We think we have two minds. We have a more rational mind, but we usually run on a more intuitive, bias, fast thinking, and that is very useful in many situations. But it can also be kind of exploited. And So nudging uses that knowledge of the human mind to drive people to make certain decisions. It doesn't force them, but kind of drives them toward a certain direction. So we know about the techniques that have been sort of studied in psychology and behavioral economics. When it comes to AI, the problem that we see is that there are really two issues. One is that when you have a sort of a kind of normal nudging technique, that is usually it's one design. Okay, it's structured it's a way of structuring the decision environment for an agent or for agents in general. It's one setting, and kind of everybody is subject to that setting, and it doesn't really change based on the person. So the idea of structuring things in that way produces certain results, but that result is average. It's like for everybody. AI nudging is a little bit different. The idea behind an AI nudging, that is also called AI manipulation or a hyper nudging, is a technique that has two important features. One is it might not have been explicitly designed by anyone. So that's the first thing. So whereas in the normal nudging, there is a designer who sort of structures the environment in a certain way, when it comes to AI nudging, AI might really shape the decision environment in various different ways. And it can do that also based on the input coming from the user. So in a hyper-personalized kind of digital environment, the information coming from a specific user, you, for instance, may be used to really shape the nudging for you. So whatever works for you is the kind of design environment that you will see. It might be different for me, it might be different for another person. And so it's probably much more effective than the regular nudging. It's hard to detect because there's no decision making being made by the human necessarily. So it can vary, and it can done, and that's the third point, which is important, at scale. So it can really have a big reach to various types of people. And so you can see that how kind of you start losing control of what's going on, and it becomes more effective. And if this is done to influence people's choices, and they don't even know that, and it's hard to show that they were influenced, and it's hard to prove, which is one of the difficulties, right? Because let's say the UI Act, for instance, does not allow for manipulative techniques, but now you got to show that there were not manipulative techniques being used, which is not easy. So all that really worries us, and that's what we tried to do in that paper, related to also in particular to the use of nudging on children, which is even more problematic.
Mm-hmm. And why is it even more problematic when we're talking about children or young adults? Mm-hmm.
So one of the features of nudging is that by sort of unconsciously prompting you to, make certain decisions, it's a little bit autonomy undermining. So it kind of really a little bit undermines your decisions, your choice, your autonomy and freedom in making decisions. It's not forcing you. So it's not completely autonomy undermining. But there have been arguments that nudging is a paternalistic choice in certain settings, and maybe sort of may infringe on people's freedom and autonomy. When it comes to children and teenagers, where the decision-making abilities maybe are less sophisticated, or less evolved, or less refined, you might think that they might be impacted even more. So their ability to resist, for instance, the temptation to stay online for long hours instead of sleeping, that might be something that nudging induces them to do, and it's not good for them, and they might have a hard time resisting that temptation. So it might really harm them in various ways that people are discussing. So that's why we think that it's particularly problematic.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting then, because this drive we've had for hyper-personalization and the opportunity to use AI and data to adaptively respond and to customize everybody's views, then actually has a potentially really negative downside. I mean, not only does it narrow our gaze to only our perspective and views. But what I hear you saying is it alters or limits our choices or even our understanding of what choices may be out there just by virtue of the technique itself.
Exactly. So there's an argument for saying that personalization is a good thing, maybe in medicine and healthcare, but in other settings, it does, raise some challenges for sure. Yes.
And you noted that this can sometimes happen really almost unintentionally, because you're designing a system to react in a way that feels good, responds to what I am doing in a way that you think I will want it to respond, and will allow me to continue to engage. And it's pursuing some commercial logic, whether that's engagement or keeping me in a game or getting me to buy different things. But that limited attention span, or that focus, maybe it's the captured attention span or that limit of choice, which, in a game, there's issues with that. But in other aspects and realms, education, healthcare, social services, this has much more impactful ramifications, very serious ramifications. What is it that organizations who are designing and deploying these systems need to do then to try to scare up or identify something that is in fact unintended or in a lot of cases unseen?
Good. Yeah. So solutions are available. It's not that this is an unsolvable problem. It's very much a solvable problem. There are various types of solutions. So there are technical solutions in the sense that you may want to use nudging for good. So that might go against certain commercial logic, but it actually would help in certain cases to use nudging techniques to actually help, for instance, children to make better choices, stay less on screens, advise them to take walks, to engage with their friends in person, as they say. My daughter says, in real life. That's what you want to play in real life. Yeah, exactly. So that kind of tools can really be turned to do good. So that's one option. There are other options, though. There are ways to empower, for instance, parents, letting them know that nudging techniques are being used on their kids, to what extent that's probably too much because their kids have been on a screen for hours. They've been seeing content that they shouldn't be seeing. So there are ways to mitigate the risk, to create those kind of factors that kind of lower the unpredictability of the tool, because that's what you want, right? You also want to sort of lower the not just the things that go on, but like the amount of entropy that is in the system. You want to lower it and put sort of guardrails to monitor what's going on. And then there are ways to educate people about this. There could be a sign or like a pop-up that says, you, in this particular moment, you have been nudged by the system in this particular way. So that creates awareness. So there are a ton of things that can be done, and that they should be done, to be honest, at this point, to empower people, users, consumers, to make more kind of reasonable and autonomous choices. Although we know that these tools will be used because they are very powerful, I think that from like organizations, companies, institutions, legislators should really come together and make decisions about this issue. Yeah, and as I said, the European Union has. We need to see in terms of the regulations and how the UI Act is going to be applied, in order to know whether some of the aspects of the law in relation to manipulation are going to be effective or not. We really need to look at the implementation phase in order to know whether this thing has teeth or whether it's just at this time not yet very useful tool to mitigate the risks of this technology.
And I think it's probably fairly easy for folks to say, clearly we should be taking these steps or putting the warning or adding some friction to the process when we're dealing with children or young adults or folks who may have, lesser understanding or exposure. But would you also agree that we should be doing this with adults as well? I have this tendency to think that those of us who work in the field and are aware overestimate how much sort of the average citizen or consumer really understands, even today, even before some of the hyper effective techniques and adaptive techniques we have now, how much of this is happening just day to day.
So this, I think, is a very interesting question. What should be the requirements when it comes to adults who are able to make decisions for themselves autonomously? Because there's a very interesting discussion on, are these techniques a form of manipulation? And if they are, is manipulation always bad? So I think that the discussion is quite nuanced and is getting a little more complicated than it was before, because it's unclear that so one thing that I would say is that you can't judge a technology without setting it in a context. Mm-hmm. So if this technique is used to making me eat more healthy food, for instance, or going to the gym more often, I'm not sure there is anything necessarily bad about it. Whereas, of course, if he does the opposite, it makes me eat like unhealthy food or not exercise, that might be a problem. But we can't regulate all kind of influences that are out there and that might sort of prompt us to make certain decisions, because then, I mean, sugary drinks is a form of nudging in a sense. It's like it's forcing us to want to drink more of that. So I guess I'm going to be sort of agnostic at this point on that question. It's like, I think that merits a kind of serious discussion about this technology and how far we can allow it. Yeah, but very good.
Very interesting. Yeah. Oh, yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking, nicotine in a cigarette, right? That was a nudging technique.
In a sense.
Right. It's physically addictive, but it's so anyway, we could spend a lot of time on that. Another interesting thing, and that's I found in that same paper, was the concept of moral inertia. So you had put in this audit framework together, and it's very explicit that the objective or the outcome is to allow organizations to maintain what you called moral inertia. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't move in particularly philosophical circles, so this may be a very common term, but it wasn't familiar to me. What is moral inertia, and why was that the right, objective, or how did you come to pick that as the end goal of an audit?
So the framework, the idea of the framework, the ethical sort of background of that audit framework, is grounded in the idea of looking at a system and looking at where there are elements of risk. And risk here is not what you usually talk about, namely the probability of harm, but it's more the idea of entropy. So how much in a system, how much entropy there is in a system, how much control there is in a system. And the idea is that where there is no control, there is less probability that harm may occur or harm that you don't know about. So the idea of the framework, in other way, is that how can you obtain knowledge of potential elements of harm by looking at elements of entropy, elements of risk, elements of lack of control. And what can you do about that? Once you figure that, okay, for instance, using nudging and hyper nudging introduces more entropy than regular nudging, for instance, because you don't know what's going to happen, you haven't tested it, you don't know what the AI is going to design as a nudge. then your goal is, unless you want to completely, discard the idea of nudging, you want to keep the nudging, you have to find ways to lower the risk, lower the effects that this nudging has, and putting guardrail in place. And that is the idea of also inertia. So inertia is the opposite of movement. So movement is seen as problematic, not morally speaking, but in terms of entropy. And if you want to get to a point in which your system is not producing moral harm or things that are like harmful for people or that wrong people in a certain way, what you want to create is a system that kind of tends to go a state of inertia, a state of less movement and less control. Okay, and you do that by just inserting guardrails. That's the only way. It's just risk mitigation processes, and these are the things that we talked about. You can have a sign that says pop up that says you're being nudged right now, or you spend 5 hours on a screen. It's time to move. Like I wish, right? There was something like that already. It was a small thing, but that kind of cools down the system and it gets you towards an inertia. Not necessarily. Is the system doing something good? Not necessarily. I mean, you're still spending 5 hours, but it's limiting the amount of harm that it's doing. Yeah. So that's the idea. And it's not necessarily a philosophical term or a term that you find a lot of philosophy. Philosophers are more interested in the idea of what is harm and what is wrong and how you define that, and maybe less about the question of how you prevent that. What are the measures that you should put in place to mitigate that? And but applied ethics, that's what you do.
But it does sound, as I said, I came across this in the paper on nudging for children, or that audit framework for nudging for children. But it did strike me that this conceptually could and should generalize to any application, right? It's any organization or individual thinking about designing or deploying these could use this concept. And it's a bit of a different spin on it, and maybe takes us out of the realm of thou shalt not do harm, which then sometimes feels a little either soft or fuzzy or just non-manageable, right? Very sort of qualitative and not something that we can address. So people have feelings about ethics and so on and so forth, but this, or even thinking about risk or harm. So this was a different terminology with a slightly different take on the issue, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, so that's what we're trying to do with that kind of framework, is to kind of get this out of really ethics in a sense, and more in terms of like, what are the responsible sort of elements in a system that bring you to a lack of control, and that can be true for any kind of system. It doesn't have to be related to AI in particular, but that you introduce features that will, and you haven't tested them, you will necessarily fake. Maybe there are going to be awesome results, and that's great, but you just don't know, and that's your responsibility. That's the lack of knowledge is the responsibility, moral responsibility is. So that's another way to say the same thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now at Logica Now, you provide a range of services, learning and development, consultative services, audits, assessments. I'm interested because you are talking in that work and in your other consultative work and academic endeavors to a very broad swath of organizations and leaders. How would you assess the current sort of gross level of awareness around ethical AI or the need for ethics in AI today? Or maybe stating that differently, what's sort of the tone at the top when you're speaking to organizations about ethics? Are they acknowledging it, embracing it, yes, butting it?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is difficult to answer in a sense because my sample may not be represented. Those who want to talk to me already have worries about
Fair.
ethics. So the impression is that people, organizations are concerned about ethical issues, maybe related to the regulations they're sort of emerging in the world, in Europe in particular, but also in the US. So there is that definitely helped. Like the UI Act really kind of sparked the discussion and brought awareness to many organizations that then reach out and ask for help. So my impression is since 2019, there's been a kind of increase. And now with UI Act and ChatGPT, I think these are the last year we have seen like a huge bump in awareness. And awareness can mean, there is awareness and there are motivations. The motivations can be different, can be compliance, can be about trust, can be about reputation, can be about just ethics, which are all, honestly, I think they're all valid. I don't think there is one that is better than the other one. We surely need to avoid ethics washing and all that, because I think that's an issue. But at this point, honestly, like seeing what we have seen, any kind of awareness is good at this point, because as there is awareness, so as I'm seeing more awareness, we're also seeing companies just keep pumping out this technology and new models and all that without really thinking it through from an ethical standpoint, which is kind of sad because, we've seen that things can go really wrong. And so you wonder, it's like, really? So it's a mixed bag. I think it's better, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, and you touch on a really important point, which is being aware that this might, maybe, could, or should be something you're considering is very different than having the organizational will and ability to actually engage and move forward on that basis.
Correct. So I'm working on a project exactly on that issue. So what is the ROI? What's the return on investment for investing when it comes to investing in AI ethics? So what are organizations getting out of it when they invest? Besides doing the right thing, but what are they hoping to get? And it's very difficult to quantify the ROI, right? Because you're avoiding lawsuits and you're avoiding fines because of regulations. That you can perhaps put a number on that, but the rest is very, very qualitative, very, very vague, and I think that is a problem because then organizations sometimes don't feel like they need to invest on this as much as they actually should. So
maybe regulation is the first stepping stone in this process because it allows us to look at some concrete elements and then start to think more broadly about harm and wrong and when and where we want to be implicated in that happening in the world.
Yeah, so regulations, public pressure, sort of public awareness, reputational risk, I think is really sometimes not considered enough, and it's actually huge. So these things may start kind of putting pressure on companies. Yeah, at least I hope.
We hope. Now, really quickly, I wanted to jump back now. Acknowledging the admittedly, as you said, smaller sample size of the organizations that are coming to you, are they falling into particular categories? Like, are there common characteristics? Do these tend to be, smaller, like the small and medium businesses? Are they large businesses? Are they coming from particular either industries or application areas? Or is it really a bit of a melting pot for who's knocking on your door these days?
It's actually very widespread and kind of, there is no one particular sector. I think maybe the banking and the telecom sector, those are definitely, especially, I mean, we're working in Europe as well. So we're seeing clients reaching out to us there even more than the US. And what we are seeing, honestly, is larger organizations being more, feeling this pressure more. And so we have been talking to large organizations in the US and in Europe. And sometimes what we see is that some of them may already have, as you said, we offer both L&D and advisory services. So when it comes to L&D, we have seen some organizations, they have the basics sort of covered. They have their AI ethics courses and training and all that. But then what we're offering are more specialized courses that are sort of tailored to specific personas. So the engineers, the HR people, the business people, those are like, they need to know about AI ethics for different reasons, and they need to be careful about different things. And so this is where we are kind of intervening, kind of more tailored. And that's what we are saying. That is an interest that we are seeing a lot. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. That's great to know, actually. And I find it positive or comforting that the folks coming to you are from across the spectrum.
Yeah.
I think as this moves forward and as we see where the liability starts to land, if liability starts to land for organizations who either, is it the developer and the supplier of a system or the deployer of that system, which is where we seem to be leaning a little bit more. Small and medium businesses will have a different and interesting challenge, I think, coming forward. And I have a lot of empathy for them for that.
Yeah, I'm really worried about them because they might not have the bandwidth to put in place all the mitigation measures, and because they require quite a bit of resources, but they also need to be preparing for what's coming. So I'm a little worried that small and medium businesses might actually fall through the cracks and feel the pain of regulators coming after them. So we'll see. Didn't happen with the GDPR. So which, I mean, regulators are going after the big guys more than the small. So that might be a comfort for them. But the AI Act feels a little different.
Which is not to say, if you're a small, medium business, that is encouraging you to move forward with your bad selves, regardless, because you have limited risk.
No. I said that happened with the GDPR, but still, the AI Act is very, very comprehensive legislation. So, yeah.
Well, you have a tool called the AI Risk Compass on your website that's available, and I imagine that which, by my read of it, helps organizations jumpstart AI risk assessment, will be helpful for organizations, small and large. So, or at least that was my hope in looking at that. It seems like a very accessible tool and approach. Now, one of the things I noticed is that you specify that it was grounded in information theory. Yeah. Why was it important to ground that approach? Why did you choose to ground it in information theory?
So this goes back a little bit to what we were saying about risk before. So my collaborator Enrico Panay is the person I wrote the paper on nudging with. He really sort of draws from a lot from the work of the philosopher Luciano Floridi, who has built a somewhat comprehensive system around information theory and really explain. And this is where the idea of risk as entropy and the idea of looking at macro structures within a situation that may kind of bring up your risk level. That's where the idea kind of came from. So honestly, the initiator of that framework is Enrico, and with me we developed this tool, And the idea of the tool is it's kind of like the idea of a thermometer. So you're not feeling well. You feel something is wrong. So use a thermometer to assess your body temperature. Now, your body temperature is too high, you have a fever, you call the doctor. You don't have a fever, so you monitor it. That's sort of the idea of the tool. Like it gives you kind of a bird eye view of your risk level. And again, I'm not talking about harm. We're talking about like how control is your system, how much control and knowledge do you have on the parts of the system. It turns out that you have very low knowledge on certain aspects, then you might need to start worrying. It's definitely not enough to tell you what you should do or what your risks in terms of harms are. Absolutely not. It's just like a pair of glass to start seeing a little better. But then you might need to really call a specialist to help you figure things out. And we use that tool on a number of clients, and I find it very helpful as an initial assessment because it gives you some understanding of really the macro structures and what are the things that you should be careful about even before you do any sort of impact analysis, ethical impact analysis, any sort of risk analysis in terms of harm. Like even before that, it kind of tells you. And even when you go in and you do that impact analysis, you might miss some features if you don't look at this broader sort of perspective. So I think there are many tools out there. So this is definitely not the only one. I feel like it is something that anybody can use. You don't need to know about ethics, don't need to know about the regulations. You just have to have an understanding of the system you're using. So I think like designers and engineers can use that.
Would it be oversimplifying to say that the intent here is to allow you to identify which risks are I was going to say the right risks, but saying the right risks doesn't sound quite right. What risks you need to be paying attention to? And as you said earlier, for organizations, there may be some risks that we're comfortable with. They're well within our risk tolerance, and there may be other risks that we are not comfortable with, either because they exceed our tolerance or they exceed some red line of how we want to operate in the world. But it sounds like this then allows you to develop a bit of a landscape, a high level view, as you said, of the landscape of risk relative to an organization. So then you can move forward and think about further assessment, remediation, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. Because it's a bird eye view, it allows you to see the whole picture. Whereas, for instance, let's assume that you use a technique called red teaming to figure out if there's something wrong with the kind of large language model you're using or the GPT or whatever. That it is one way to look at the problems, and it really is very effective in figuring out how things can go south and what the problems could be. I think that's, for instance, absolutely needed, but it doesn't cover other aspects. For instance, the impact the control that you have on the people receiving the information, because you might have people who, even the information you're sending is supposedly neutral, you might have people that are unable or that might misinterpret that information. So if you have not studied what's called your stakeholders very well, that's risk. Okay, that is something that you should know, that you're incurring in a risk if you don't look at the stakeholders and the users. For instance, you don't do a semantic analysis of them. You might not want to do it. Maybe there's no problem, but it's a choice. Yeah, that's the thought. That's the sort of the idea.
Make sure you're making those choices mindfully and not
exactly.
just by virtue of not having tried to look at them at all or averting your gaze, I suppose.
Exactly.
You've mentioned or been careful to specify that you're talking about risk and not harm. Mm-hmm. Why is that an important differentiation?
So risk is how many factors are in a system that you cannot control. I think that the metaphor I like is video games. I think is a useful way. So when I was a kid, there were my grandpa had a sort of video game and I would play on this one or more video games. And there was a console, and you have to put money in it, and then you have to play. And then if you lose, you just die, and you lose the money, and you're gone. So it's a very self-contained system. Of course, I can spend, if I'm very rich, I can spend a lot of money and a lot of time on it. But it does kind of constrain the time that you can actually spend on this thing, although I used to spend a lot of time on it. Now, okay, you have a different system in which kids stay on these platforms. They are prompt to stay more and more. They engage with other people online as they're on the platform. So that's also something reinforcing their desire to stay on the gaming platform. So there are so many factors brought in that are very difficult to monitor. So it's very difficult to monitor who is the kid interacting with when it's on this gaming platform. There could be an adult on the other side, and the kid doesn't know. So all these things, they're not harmful by all. There's nothing harmful about like an open environment. Yeah. But it is risky because it is an environment in which if there are bad actors on the other side, the kid might incur some harm. Now, it might also bring good, like it's the ability of the child to interact with people diverse from herself or himself, and so learn things. Or this kind of games are used in schools to prompt STEM kind of reasoning or wonderful, right? But you need to assess that, because in and of itself, the difference between what was happening when I was a kid and what's happening now is that the amount of things that can go wrong is just much more as the amount of advantages that you can get. So this is what our tools talks about is I'm going to give you a number. I'm telling you how much unknown there is in your system. And then you can do whatever you want with that information. And I'm going to tell you if there is unknown in the environment, there is unknown how you relate to, how the system relates to the user. It's unknown within the system itself. And I'm telling you, these are your blind spots. Yeah. And that's it. That's not harmful. There's nothing harmful in blind spots. But they may invite harm. That's the difference.
Yeah, I like this because in a lot of conversations I've had or I've heard, there's a tendency to want to disintermediate risk from harm. And what I hear you saying, and you should absolutely correct me if I'm wrong, please, is that in fact, by looking at risk through this particular lens, which is a little bit different than I've, others approaches, that by identifying those risks or where there may be areas of heightened risk in the system by virtue of the fact that you either don't have insight or, as you said, there's a lack of control, then you can use to say this risk then invites or may generate this harm. And so that it has a more tangible connection to just saying harm as, what is sort of societal good or, human well-being and flourishing, which is all important. I don't think, there's nobody we're going to go up to and they're going to say, no, we don't think that's important, even if they disagree. Yeah. But at least if you're any sort of, reasonably socially intelligent creature. But because that sometimes is that very qualitative, it feels just sort of, social and political and all of those bits. I think this idea that the risk helps you then think through or identify where harm may occur is a better conceptualization of both of those.
Yeah, we hope that is helpful, and we insist on the idea that it is not something that should require knowing about ethics, because otherwise you're starting importing what you think ethics is and what you are, and then like it is, you need a specialist for that, as you need a doctor to assess your health. You need an ethicist to determine these things. You can do it by yourself or Googling it. And so, although many people do it, but you can't not do it.
That's a whole other conversation.
Exactly. I mean, you shouldn't do it. And so similarly, don't improvise, because if you improvise and assume that people who have no training in ethics can do ethical risk analysis, then you are really importing more risk into your system because they don't know, they are not aware of the regulations, they are not aware of the impacts. So we recommend having, for those organizations that can do it, establish an ethics committee that is empowered, and make sure that on that ethics committee you have a diverse pool of people, including people who are not just computer scientists or engineers, but also people who know about ethics and know about anthropology and know about sociology, that can really give you a sort of 360 view of how things can impact society and your users and so on and so forth. So that is an absolutely key point that unfortunately I'm not seeing. So a lot of organizations don't have ethicists on their board.
Your work is fascinating. It covers so many bounds. So I have two other areas I want to ask you about quickly. One is on the concept of trust. Now, we've seen this evolution over time, many years ago. I guess it's not so many years ago, but maybe pre-pandemic, we were talking about FATE, right? Fairness, accountability, trust, and ethics. And then it was responsible AI, and now it's trustworthy AI seems to be the term du jour. I'm not sure it matters so much about what we call it as much as what we are trying to address with it. But this conversation around trust has been really interesting because there's a lot of discussion about how do we get people to trust the systems, or are we trying to make systems that are trustworthy? And we get caught up in these semantics. You have argued, though, that in fact, maybe our current definitions of trust are too restrictive and based on a bit of a conceptual error. And presumably, my take from that then is that will limit our ability to, in fact, develop or engage with these AI systems in the most meaningful way. So what is it that we are getting wrong in the discourse around trust and AI today?
So I think what we are getting wrong is that if we see trust, if you conceive of trust as only a relationship between two full-blown moral agents, then of course you cannot talk about trusting AI or distrusting AI, because AI is not a full-blown moral agent. It's not going to be anytime soon. So I think that we need, I'm not opposed of using the idea of trusting AI or trustworthy AI. I actually think that is, I'm totally okay with the term. What I am not okay with is conflating the type of trust that we could have towards AI with the type of trust that we have towards our friends, towards our fellow human beings. Okay, so there are slightly two things going on, and this might not have a huge impact on the sort of AI ethics space beyond academia. Although there are some academics who are worried about using the notion of trust, especially as one of the foundations of the EU AI Act. I think that worries are overblown. I think that those worries should not be taken too seriously, because they are working with only a limited notion of trust. They just think that you can trust only humans. That's not true. It's true that when you talk about trusting your car, your just normal car, you're thinking about relying on the car, not really trusting it. But we trust, for instance, animals. I trust my dog. In a sense, I may trust my cat not to do certain things. And I feel disappointment and even some level of resentment, to be honest, if my dog does things that I don't expect, and I think that she shouldn't do. So I think that there are like levels of agency. Okay, like my Roomba doesn't have any agency. My friend has full-blown agency, but there's a lot in between. There are animals, as I said, and I think AI, as it's been developed now, merits a little more trust or credibility than my Roomba in terms of the things that I am expecting the AI to do. And by expecting, I don't mean that only in a sort of that I'm foreseeing the AI doing, but I'm sort of normatively expecting. I have a normative expectation. I think that the AI should not be biased. I think the AI should not discriminate. And that doesn't mean that if there is an AI that discriminates, then the fault is in the AI. The fault is in whoever, put that out there and sort of designed it and so on and so forth. So there are different things. Like I can trust my AI, I can trust my dog. I don't think that, however, my dog or the AI is more irresponsible. The owner is more irresponsible if the dog bites someone. And so if the AI goes wrong, the designers, maybe the company, I don't know, but someone else is more responsible. So let's not confuse these different levels. That's what philosophers do. They try to make things clear. And so I'm fully behind the framework that has been recently used of trustworthy. I think it's a good term. And I am hoping that the discussion around trust doesn't undermine that kind of the effort of the European Union around that. So
yeah, we should trust that the system is working exactly as it is designed to do, intentionally or unintentionally, and make decisions accordingly, exactly. Right? And respond accordingly. Yeah, very interesting. Now I have to, I realize we're coming up on time here, but I have to sneak one last question in. You recently, I think it was just recently here in 2024, but it may have been previously, I published a paper examining the basis of irrational beliefs. And I found this really fascinating. I can't claim that I understood it properly or at the depth it requires, but you essentially argue that every belief, no matter how epistemically irrational, and perhaps we should define epistemically irrational for folks, is underpinned by a minimum of rationality. Mm-hmm. And aside from this very interesting hypothesis, it got me thinking in the context of AI very specifically, like in the context of the extreme hypering that is happening right now, do you think the folks that are making outrageous claims today about some of the capabilities or purported capabilities of some of these systems truly believe it? Do they merely want it to be true? Or is this hypering have nothing to do with sort of the minimum rationality and irrational belief, but it's coming straight from commercially motivated PR?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I suspect that, there is a bit of everything. I think there is a lot of PR. There is also a lot of hope and excitement around this technology, genuine excitement. It is moving fast. It's hard to deny that. Sometimes it feels like announcements like in 2 years we're going to have a full autonomous car, and then it doesn't happen. And then in 2 years or we have a general artificial intelligence, and that doesn't happen. So it feels that they're playing a sort of PR game as well. And so that's a little unfortunate, but I think it's part of the game. It's not surprising.
Yeah.
In terms of irrationality, so I think your question is very interesting because it kind of relates to like all other sorts of irrationalities that we have, like fake news and like conspiracy theories, and like people seem to believe all sorts of crazy stuff. And I think there are some philosophers of the past have argued that cannot be right. The people cannot be completely out of their minds, so irrational. Mm-hmm. There has got to be a limit, because otherwise we wouldn't understand each other as people, as speakers, as communicators. So I think that idea is right. And I think that that is right also for fake news and the rest. So when people say things, they might be honest. They were trying to say things that are somewhat true, but they might not really believe them. And so we need to be careful not to sort of project too much on people, thinking that they are like so clear on what they believe and so clear on what their really views are. People sometimes just talk and say things, and that's it. And yeah. So I think that's the sort of the moral of the story.
I had a previous colleague and boss, and he's fantastic, but he says everything in a tone that is very confident and just very, not necessarily loud, but it's very, it has a level of settled. It sounds settled, right? It sounds like he's made up his mind, and it's not necessarily. And I've, I had to go back at some point and tell everyone that's just the way he communicates. And in fact, when he's doing that, he's asking a question, and you need to respond accordingly and not assume that he's telling you what to do, because he's really, in most cases, likely looking for feedback or input. And it strikes me that that's a little bit here too, which is let's just not assume they're completely off their rocker or completely trying to behave nefariously. But there might be some inkling of something you were just not seeing in there. So
Right. That sounds right.
And now I've proven why I'm not a philosophy major. So in any case.
No, what are you talking about? You should have been a philosophy.
Thank you. You're very kind, clearly. Any final, thoughts, words of wisdom for the audience before we let you go?
Sure. Like, I want to sort of shed some maybe light on one thing that I mentioned before, and that I think is important. I'm optimistic about. I'm optimistic in general as a person, but in particular, I'm optimistic about AI and AI ethics. I think that the field is moving in the right direction, and that we're doing the right things. I would like to see more interdisciplinary work at the level of the companies when it comes to AI ethics. It's great that some big companies are all in terms of trying to build mitigation processes and committees and all that. But you need to have a broader array of people in those committees, and you really need to decide what it means to be an ethicist, and to what kind of skills you need, because I think that's a little fuzzy, and people are not really sure what they should be looking for. And I think we need more guidance on, like, these are the things that establish that you're a doctor. These are the things that establish you're an ethicist. Like, kind of, these are the things that we need clarity and transparency on those issues as well. So I think that's my final comment.
I know. I think that's a fascinating point, and this has been really interesting and helpful, I think, to the audience and certainly to me. So thank you so much for being very generous with your time and insights, and just continuing to do the work of making ethical inquiry, if you will, both palatable and accessible to everybody in the field.
Thank you so much.
All right. So to continue learning from thinkers and doers such as Marianna, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, or follow us on YouTube.